Prof. Steinburg, you have in your report used Israel or the experiences of Israel as a focus, and to use that to share some examples or some lessons with us in Singapore as we deliberate and study the issue of online falsehoods. Correct?
That is correct.
Israel has itself been the target of sustained, sophisticated, coordinated campaign of delegitimization for several years. Correct?
That is correct.
And that's largely been done through the use of gross distortions, falsehoods, particularly against Israel in the UN, by powerful NGOs, which we'll come to in a minute, mainstream media, as well as social media platforms. That would be correct?
That's an accurate summary, yes.
And you've also taken the view that social media, particularly Twitter and Facebook, has, in your words, greatly amplified this problem. Would you care to elaborate on that briefly?
For the last at least 15 years, there has been a very specific and articulated campaign using what's called soft power, sometimes it's called political warfare, to the terms that are used are to create a situation for the complete international isolation of Israel. That's a statement from a group of 1,500 non-governmental organizations that met in Durban, South Africa in September 2001. And they established a series of procedures such as allegations of apartheid, allegations of war crimes, allegations of ethnic cleansing, in a situation in which none of those terms even remotely apply. And then over the last 15, 16 years, they've been developing this strategy. They've been implementing this strategy. I focus particularly on NGOs, non-governmental organizations, groups that claim to be part of a human rights network, because that was an area of research that was completely empty. Nobody had looked at that, and I decided at that time, 15, 16 years ago, that was important to examine. It's not the only factor in the process, because very often a very powerful NGO, these are worldwide organizations, groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and many others, will issue condemnations, will issue reports based on hearsay, based often on second, third, fourth-hand testimonies, which they cannot check. They do not check. They sometimes are testimonies, which usually have been orchestrated. And then those are published in mainstream media outlets, not just in terms of Facebook and Twitter and social media, where there is a serious problem as well, but also in mainstream media outlets throughout the world, in most cases without bothering to check the accuracy of those claims. Mm-hmm. And there's a third element, with your permission, I'll just add right now, and that is the allegations. There are questions of fact and there are questions of analysis, because we get the factual allegations that would claim that a certain number of people, civilians, were killed, and of course they may not be civilians, they may not have been killed, there may be, all these questions are left open, but then those same organizations declare these activities, which may or may not have taken place, to be violations of international law. And those things are also quoted without any serious analysis of whether, in fact, how international law may or may not play into this process. So you have this combination of factors together, which have been used, again, very consciously as part of a political warfare strategy.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Prof. I understand that. Would you say that such information would travel reasonably well on the social media platforms, being in a sense that
it's almost
instantaneous?
The claims that are made by these organizations, and sometimes they may come straight from the media, are immediately picked up. That's the nature of social media. Yes. And as I said in my submitted testimony, and I can elaborate on that, Facebook, Twitter, even Instagram, other blogs, they are instantly circulated. And what we usually have is a phenomenon where you may have a few thousand or sometimes a few tens of thousands of either real or fake accounts that immediately will copy and paste and like and retweet and quote exactly the same claims that are made. And then they take on a life of their own, in which, again, there is almost no effort made to evaluate the accuracy both of the factual claims or of the analysis, the legal claims, and certainly the social media makes this happen almost instantaneously. And for a government, for a responsible government, where the facts have to be checked, where let's say there might have been an incident and the government wants to determine whether, in fact, that incident, the description of that incident, including claims of casualties, was accurate, a government, a military force, police force, security forces don't have the luxury of making instant claims. So the false claims stay on the social media for a long time before the responsible parties are able to counter those. And even if it's 5 hours late or 1 day late, it's almost impossible in those situations to deal with that process.
Right. Thank you, Prof. And going back to your paper, I think that's also the experience you shared, because you explained that the Israeli initial counter strategies was done through the old media platforms, and that proved to be ineffective, much slower.
Yes, I would say the old days, if we go back 20, 30 years, then there was, I would say, more of a balance in terms of the time process.
Okay.
That the media claims, and also if you go back 10, 15, 20 years, the NGOs were not nearly as politically powerful. They certainly became more powerful for reasons that have to do with the media itself, but also with legal processes and other aspects we can talk about later. But in the previous era, where we had what's called mainstream media, and I think journalists were more careful. They were less interested, or there was less emphasis on instant headline grabbing and how many retweets and how many likes you get, so that journalists, and I'm saying this somewhat carefully because I think a broad statement is difficult to do, but there was greater concern, greater care, greater professionalism in making these allegations. Also, they didn't have the access that you have now. If somebody claims to be in an area where there is an incident, let's say a terror attack, and there are people that are injured or killed, and some of them may be terrorists or may not be civilians, it's part of the asymmetric warfare situation, because there tends to be always terrorism takes place in a civilian environment, and to sort out the details of what happened. A journalist in the previous era would spend the time, because the next deadline would not be till the next morning. Now, there's somebody there with a camera, there's somebody there with a Facebook account and with Twitter, and they'll put it out there immediately, and that will become the basis for the narrative, not the way it took place 15 or 20 years ago when one waited for the journalist to report, and at the same time you had it maybe once a day. The newspaper would come out, the nightly news would be on, the radio would say it, but it would not have this instant, I have to immediately claim to say things which I can't really verify and I don't really know.
Yes. So nowadays with a mobile phone, you can publish anything, whether it's text or photo, from anywhere in the world. And
that publication, that instant publication, will immediately get, because the network's in place, thousands of repetitions, retweets, quotes, and posts, without any analysis of the accuracy.
Yes, and in fact, we've been told by some other witnesses who've come before you that sometimes these are all amplified through the use of bots, which are basically automatic but non-human devices, which would then influence the reach, the retweets, and in turn influence what one might then see on the social media platforms. Correct?
That process of amplifying artificially is well known. We now see the perhaps partly artificial bots and partly real people with fake names through the claims that of Russian influence on American elections and in other countries as well. The more powerful an organization is, the more powerful an NGO is, the more power, which means the larger the budget they have. I'll give you the example of Human Rights Watch, which I've studied in great detail. They don't have a public accounting in detail, but approximately their budget now is $75 million a year. For $75 million a year, you can buy a lot of technology. Yes. You can buy a lot of people who can create the bots, create the ability to amplify a claim of a violation of human rights, of a war crime, of some other area in which they are seen as experts. And that will then be picked up immediately, and then it's very difficult to refute that.
Right. Thank you, Prof.
So the
Steinburg.
bots do play an important amplification role in this area as well.
Yes, I understand. I will take you to one of your papers on Human Rights Watch, but maybe after I've gone through a couple of other questions concerning page 3 of your report, if I may ask you to please turn to that page. Here is where you deal with the subsequent line of responses by the subsequent line of countermeasure responses by the Israelis to meet the speed at which such information is being quickly pervaded, transmitted widely, and as you say, instantaneously. And if you just look at the first full paragraph from the top, right at the bottom, you say that false allegations are then quickly challenged on Twitter and Facebook, reducing the visibility and impact of these claims. You would describe that as having a lot more effect at being able to either counter entirely or at the very least mitigate effectively the falsehoods. Would you agree?
I would agree with that characterization, and it is reflected in my submitted evidence. If I might, with your permission, I can expand on that point.
Yes, please.
As I wrote, there are the Israeli government, which was the target of these attacks, this soft power warfare and political warfare for many years, tried a number of strategies unsuccessfully. They tried legal strategies, legislation, countering in terms of media, but they were slow because of the need for accuracy. If a government is caught claiming something that they had not checked carefully, and it turns out to be incorrect, that it's a very strong penalty in terms of image. If an NGO makes a claim, and they often do, that are proven false, nobody pays much attention to that, and they continue, because they have their sources of funding, they continue to repeat that. And the Israeli government had a lot of trouble, therefore, dealing with these kinds of organizations at the beginning. And slowly, and more recently, they evolved a strategy of real-time responses. Not just responses, but I would say not reaction, but pre-action, in the sense of preparing the ground, knowing the pattern. And we saw that in the case of in 2010, where there was a flotilla of boats that were trying to break a blockade that Israel has imposed on arms that go to a terrorist organization in Gaza, Hamas and other terrorist groups. And that was a process in which NGOs and terrorist organizations work together, which is not unusual. And the goal of that process was not to actually provide humanitarian aid, but it was to embarrass the Israeli government in an incident in which the narrative, the pictures, the story would be entirely told from the NGO and terror organizations' perspective. And in this case, the Israeli government, having learned the failures over at least 10 years before that, had in place Twitter, Facebook, and mainstream media and all of the pieces. They were still, because they had to check the accuracy, there was still a few hours lag. But within 12 to 24 hours, the Israeli version was not only available, but it was available in video, and it was available in eyewitness testimony, and that served as a counterbalance. And over the years, the NGO and terror group narrative of what happened has not become the dominant narrative. And I would say there were still things that the Israeli government needs to be able to do to make that process more effective. But the fact that they were able within a few hours to put video material on, to put eyewitness testimony on, and repeat that did make a difference.
So what I'm hearing from you is that for an effective counterbalance, in your words, one has to be able to react quickly with speed. Would you agree?
I think one has to be able to fight the battle, as is the case in military and security areas, on the battlefield that the other side is using. So if the other side is using social media, then an effective counter to that has to also involve significantly social media, with all the pieces already in place before the events take place.
Right. And one must also reduce, in your words again at page 3 of your report, one must also reduce the visibility and impact of these false claims. To reduce the visibility is an important aspect of that counterbalance, because we've heard that falsehoods travel faster than truths, and also falsehoods somehow, heuristically or otherwise, tend to feature more prominently on a reader's mind and is more believable and more likely to be believed. And so therefore, I would suggest that as part of the suite of options available for the counterbalance, the speed at which one could remove the false claim would be important. Would you agree?
I would agree that speed is extremely important. That is the most important dimension of social media in the political realm, is the speed with which reports travel without regard to their accuracy. There, in social media particularly, there is no mechanism for regulating, for examining the accuracy, and therefore one must, to counter this, be very quick in the responses and have the mechanisms to do that, the technical aspects, the substantive aspects to do that. A few hours makes a huge difference. Even sometimes 1 hour can make a big difference because of the things that we talked about, the bots, the amplification. The entire process goes so very quickly. And sometimes that also means restricting access of NGOs so that they cannot claim to be on the spot and having accurate information. That's a complicated process, but it is part of the broader strategy that's being attempted.
Right. So the speed that you speak about has to be a combination of both being able to remove the false information as well as put out the true information in as quick a time as possible.
I agree with that to some degree. Removing false information is extremely difficult to do. There are very few legal aspects. There is a process now going on in Europe, the United States, of trying to regulate Facebook false allegations after the fact, and that's both technically difficult because it's a virus which duplicates so very quickly that you can, for instance, you can take a video off of YouTube and it will come back on sometimes within 5 minutes, and it's always you're trying to hit the in the British terms it's called whack-a-mole. Every time it comes up from the ground, you hit it and then it comes back up in a different place. So removing falsehoods from false media is a very complicated and not always successful approach. Countering those falsehoods and overwhelming the ability of the whether it's the NGOs or the media or an opponent that's able to camouflage their activities through those processes, the ability to counter them with credible material, and then video again is very important to that.
Yes, I understand.
It's an important part.
I understand what you say. Leaving aside the technical difficulties, the whack-a-mole kind of scenario, I think you would agree that keeping the false information or misleading information online for longer than is necessary would have a very negative effect. So to the extent that you could remove it, to the extent that it's technically possible to remove it, I think one should do that or endeavor to do that as quickly as possible. Would you agree?
It is, yes, in theory. I just know that the experience of trying to get blatantly false information off the social media platforms is extremely difficult. With your permission, I can give you an example of that.
Yes.
If you have time. In 2002, and it goes back quite a while, but there was this was at the beginning of this period. The internet was active. There was not, I don't think we had Facebook yet in those days or Twitter, but there were other forms of internet viral activity. And there was a claim that was made that Israel, in preventing suicide bombings, which were killing hundreds of people, the Israeli military went into the center of these terrorist activities called Jenin, and there were battles there for a day. And the claim was made that the Israeli military had incurred a massacre. The word massacre was used. The first time that it was used by political propagandists, and then Amnesty International on the BBC claimed that this was a massacre. They said, we can confirm it. Now, the Amnesty had absolutely no idea. They had no access. Nobody was there. It was a closed military zone. It was a small area. And a year later, the NGOs and the United Nations agreed there was no massacre. But if you go onto the internet today and you look under the keywords, you will still see a lot of those allegations from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, and from dozens of other smaller NGOs. So removing a blatantly false piece of information, deliberately false information, even under the best of circumstances, I would suggest from the experience, is extremely difficult to do. You won't get down to zero in most cases. You might be able to and I do agree that if you can reduce it by 50%, it's already an important accomplishment.
Yes.
But I think one should be realistic about how that's going to play out.
Yes, but I mean, the example you've just outlined tells us at least two things. The first is obviously taking steps to try to remove it to the extent possible would be the most ideal course of action. Whether one achieves it in practice or not is something else. Correct?
That is correct.
Yes.
And of course, because it's international, so that a national government can only be effective within its borders unless it goes to legal processes, and those take time. Whether it's in Europe or the United States or any place else in the world where there's a great access to open access to social media.
Right, and that's precisely one of the angles that this committee will be looking at. But the second takeaway from what you've said in your example would be that the fact that these misleading, untrue, false videos remain online and accessible itself tells you, and which then continues to create the effect of the misimpression, itself tells you that that's what needs to be done, to target the removal of these false information as soon as possible, subject, of course, always to the practicalities of doing so. Would you accept?
I would suggest to preempt, in the sense of it will be more effective if there are mechanisms, and I don't suggest that these are easy, but there is some work in this area, some experience, in preventing the initial posting of false information. And I specifically focus in an area where there are casualties, terrorist action in particular, and the ability to prevent the social media access. And I did say this with a great deal of caution in a democratic framework, but there are times when governments do impose blackouts on and I think there are a number of aspects to that. It's not only in terms of false information, but it's also false information could be saying that a particular individual, we know that let's say someone puts on, and this has happened, on WhatsApp or on some other form of Twitter, we know there was a terrorist attack in a certain place, and a certain individual with a name was killed. And let's say that's false information. And we have instances of that.
Understand.
Then the families are immediately affected.
Yes.
It creates terrible tragedy. And if it's false information and it's only cleared up a few hours later, because in a terrorist environment you cannot immediately, responsible authorities cannot immediately sort out the details of casualties. And that false information already becomes online. If it was not online, if there was a blackout in the area of the terrorist incident, then in terms of being able to post in social media, and that's a technical issue, and many governments now have that capability, then the false information, as is the case of military, when there's a battle taking place in a military area, then there's a censorship that's imposed, and every government does that. Afghanistan and Iraq, and in the case of Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah and other places, that's a very standard practice. And it's important to protect the troops and to prevent the enemy from getting intelligence information. That can also be provided through Twitter and social media, so one has to be very careful about that access.
Yes.
Now, and that's preemption. That's before the falsehood gets on, you don't have to deal with the falsehoods if the ability to access the social media is limited under those very specific circumstances.
So either preempting or even prophylactically remove it before you can even get it online, to that extent.
That seems to me the more effective response, with the realization that there must be legal and other protective aspects to it